The Persian rug had been there so long that the floorboards beneath it had faded to a different shade than the rest of the room. Elena noticed this the moment the movers lifted one corner to navigate the couch through the narrow doorway. 70 years. Her grandmother had lived in this house. 70 years of footsteps crossing that rug, of furniture arranged and rearranged around it, of life happening on its worn surface. But in all that time, no one had lifted it completely. No one had looked underneath. The movers set the couch down and left, their truck rumbling away into the autumn afternoon, and Eleanor stood alone in the living room of her inheritance, staring at that corner of exposed floor. Something about the color difference bothered her, nagged at her architect's eye for detail and proportion. The rug measured roughly 12 by 15 feet, an antique her grandmother claimed had come from her own grandmother, passed down through generations like a textile heirloom. Its patterns had faded to muted burgundies and golds, its edges frayed despite careful maintenance. Elena had always assumed it covered ordinary hardwood, the same honey-toned oak that ran throughout the rest of the house. But that exposed corner showed something else entirely. Wood so dark it was almost black, worn smooth but clearly different in species and age from the surrounding floor. She knelt down and ran her fingers along the boundary where the rug's edge met the floor. The transition was sharp, deliberate. This wasn't simply aged wood. This was a section of floor that had been replaced or installed separately and then hidden. For 70 years, her grandmother had walked over this rug without ever mentioning what lay beneath it, had decorated around it, had made it the centerpiece of the room, and had died 3 months ago without ever explaining why. If you're already hooked and want to see what Elena discovers beneath that rug, make sure you hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Drop a like if you love mysteries that make your skin crawl, and leave a comment telling me what country and city you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers around the world who share a passion for the unexplained. There's something uniquely unsettling about discovering that the spaces we thought we knew have been hiding secrets in plain sight. Elena Montgomery had inherited her grandmother's house in the small town of Millbrook, a place she'd visited countless times as a child, but never truly examined with adult eyes. The house dated back to 1889, a Victorian with gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch that overlooked what had once been farmland but was now encroached upon by suburban development. Her grandmother, Dorothy Ashford, had been the kind of woman who kept everything in its place, who maintained traditions and routines with almost religious devotion. The Persian rug in the living room had been one of those constants, its position marked by decades of furniture arrangement. When Elena had asked about it as a teenager, her grandmother had simply said it had been in the family forever and left it at that. Now, sorting through the estate and preparing to either sell or renovate, Elena found herself alone with the house's accumulation of history, its layers of paint and wallpaper and secrets, and that rug that suddenly seemed less like a decorative choice and more like a deliberate concealment. She spent the rest of that first day unpacking essentials and making the house habitable for the weeks ahead. The estate lawyer had estimated it would take at least a month to sort through everything, to decide what to keep, what to donate, what to sell. Elena had taken a leave from her architecture firm in Boston, welcomed the excuse to escape the city's relentless pace and spend time in a place thick with childhood memories. But as darkness fell, and she found herself alone in the creaking Victorian, those memories took on different textures. She remembered her grandmother's strict rules about certain rooms, the way she'd become agitated if Elena played too roughly in the living room, how she'd always insisted that the rug remain exactly where it was, positioned with mathematical precision. At the time, Elena had assumed this was simply elderly fastidiousness, the quirk of someone who valued order above all else. Now she wondered if it had been something else entirely. The house settled around her as evening deepened, its old bones creaking and sighing in the autumn wind. Eleanor found herself walking through rooms she'd known since childhood, seeing them differently now. The parlour, where she'd played with her grandmother's collection of porcelain figurines. The dining room, where holiday meals had been served on china that had belonged to ancestors Elena had never met. The narrow back staircase that had always frightened her as a child, though she'd never been able to articulate why. Everything felt weighted with significance now, with the possibility that ordinary spaces concealed extraordinary secrets. She made dinner in the outdated kitchen, ate standing at the counter, and tried to ignore the pull of the living room, the unanswered question lying flat and silent under that ancient rug. But curiosity, once awakened, doesn't sleep. By 9 o'clock, she'd given up pretending she could wait until morning. The rug was heavier than expected, its backing stiff with age and accumulated dust. Elena started at one corner, rolling it back slowly, revealing inch by inch what her grandmother had spent a lifetime concealing. The dark wood continued, forming a clearly defined rectangle about 8 feet by 10 feet, set into the surrounding oak floor like a puzzle piece that didn't quite match. The wood itself was strange, not just in color but in texture. It had been worn smooth, almost polished, but not by the passage of feet. This was intentional smoothing, the kind that came from sustained, focused attention, and there were marks. Elena grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, kneeling close to examine what she was seeing. Scratches, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, carved into the dark wood in frantic, chaotic patterns. They weren't random. As her eyes adjusted and her perspective shifted, she began to see repetition in the chaos, the same symbols appearing over and over, some crude, some startlingly intricate, all carved with what must have been desperate intensity. Her hands trembled as she traced the patterns, feeling the depth of the grooves, the violence that must have been required to cut so deeply into hardwood. Some marks were shallow, tentative, as if the carver had started uncertain. Others were gouged deep, the work of someone who'd lost all restraint, who'd attacked the floor with almost savage determination. Her architect's training kicked in, and she began documenting, taking photographs from multiple angles, measuring the dimensions, noting the patterns. The symbols defied immediate interpretation, but certain elements recurred. Circles within circles, stick figures with too many limbs, words or letters she couldn't quite decipher in the inadequate light. Between the symbols, she found dates scratched in tiny numerals, some barely visible, others carved with emphasis. The earliest date she could make out was March 1891. The most recent appeared to be December 1894. 3 years of obsessive carving. 3 years of whatever had driven someone to document their anguish in wood. She needed better illumination, proper tools to examine this properly. Elena retrieved a camping lantern from her car and a tape measure from her toolkit, then settled in for a closer investigation. The wood appeared to be walnut, old growth judging by the tight grain, installed deliberately to cover something or mark something or preserve something. The scratches varied in depth and age, some weathered and grey, others sharper and darker, suggesting they'd been made over an extended period. She traced one pattern with her finger, following a spiral that began at the edge and coiled inward to a central point. Where the spiral ended, a single word had been carved in letters barely a quarter-inch high. Forgive. She sat back, heart hammering. This wasn't decorative carving or artistic expression. This was documentation, confession, prayer, or possibly all three. Someone had spent hours, maybe days, maybe years, on their knees on this floor, carving message after message into the wood, then covering it with a rug and pretending it didn't exist. The psychological weight of that struck her forcefully. What kind of guilt or fear or need drove someone to literally inscribe their anguish into the floor, then hide it from the world? She thought about her grandmother, about the precise way she'd lived, the control she'd maintained over every aspect of her environment. Had Dorothy known about this? Had she inherited both the rug and the secret, continuing a tradition of concealment that stretched back generations? Elena remembered moments from her childhood that suddenly took on new meaning. The time she'd spilled juice on the rug, and her grandmother had nearly wept with anxiety, scrubbing at the stain with a fervor that seemed excessive. The way Dorothy had always kept the living room furniture arranged in exactly the same configuration, as if moving a chair even 6 inches would somehow disturb a delicate balance. The afternoon Elena had suggested rolling up the rug for the summer, and her grandmother had become so agitated that she'd had to take one of her pills and lie down. These weren't the quirks of an orderly woman. These were the behaviors of someone guarding a secret, someone who knew what lay beneath the surface and was determined that it would stay hidden. Elena photographed every visible symbol, every word she could make out, creating a digital record before she disturbed anything further. As she worked, more words emerged from the chaos: mercy, witness, remember, forgive, again and again, and once, in slightly larger letters near the center, she screamed. That stopped Elena cold. She rocked back on her heels, the camping lantern casting wild shadows across the scarred wood. This wasn't guilt over some abstract sin or theological crisis. This was someone processing specific trauma, recording an event they couldn't forget and perhaps didn't want to forget, even as they hid the evidence. She checked the time. Nearly midnight. Too late to call anyone, too disturbing to leave alone. She made coffee, strong and black, and settled in to map the entire surface. The process took hours. By 3 in the morning, she'd identified 17 distinct sections, each containing different messages or symbol patterns, arranged in a rough chronological progression from the edges inward. The oldest carvings, judged by their weathering and the wood's patina, were simplest, dates ranging from 1891 to 1894, followed by single words like departed or returned. The middle sections grew more complex, introducing the repetitive symbols and fragmented phrases. The center, the newest section based on the relatively fresh-cut marks, contained the most disturbing content. Detailed pictographic scenes showing stick figures in various positions of distress, accompanied by desperate pleas for forgiveness and mercy. One scene in particular made Elena's skin crawl. A stick figure, clearly meant to represent a woman based on the triangle dress shape, was drawn lying down, surrounded by 4 other figures standing over her. Lines radiated from the prone figure's head, and the word screaming was carved multiple times in a circle around the scene. Below it, in shakier letters, I could not stop it, and below that, God help me, I could not stop. The repetition, the desperation in those words, the way they'd been carved and recarved, deepening the grooves as if emphasis could somehow change what had happened. All of it spoke to profound trauma and guilt. Morning light filtering through the curtains caught her by surprise. Elena had worked through the night without noticing, so absorbed in decoding the floor that time had slipped past unmarked. She was exhausted, wired on caffeine and adrenaline, but she'd compiled a rough translation of what lay beneath her grandmother's rug. Someone in this house, sometime between 1891 and what appeared to be the early 1900s, had experienced or witnessed something traumatic involving a woman who screamed. That person had carved their testimony into the floor over months or years, documenting their guilt and seeking forgiveness from whoever might eventually discover their confession. Then they, or someone who came after, had covered it with a rug, and the cover-up had lasted more than a century. Elena needed to know who had done this, needed to understand what had happened in this house that demanded such obsessive documentation and subsequent concealment. She showered, changed, and drove into town to the Millbrook Historical Society, which opened at 9. The volunteer at the desk, a woman in her 70s who introduced herself as Pauline, brightened when Elena explained her grandmother's identity and her questions about the house's history. Pauline led her to a back room filled with filing cabinets and archival boxes, explaining that Millbrook had been meticulous about record-keeping since its founding in 1867. The house at 247 Oak Street had been built in 1889 by a man named Jonathan Ashford, Elena's great-great-grandfather. He'd been a doctor, relatively prosperous, with a wife named Catherine and 3 daughters. Pauline pulled census records, city directories and newspaper clippings, spreading them across a research table. Elena scanned through them, building a timeline. Jonathan and Catherine had lived in the house from 1889 until Catherine's death in 1894. The death certificate, when Pauline located it, listed the cause as influenza, though the attending physician's signature was Jonathan's own, which struck Elena as odd. After Catherine's death, Jonathan had continued living in the house with his daughters until his own death in 1919. The property had passed to his eldest daughter, Margaret, who'd married and eventually passed it to her daughter, Dorothy, Elena's grandmother. 3 generations of direct descent, the house never leaving family control. Elena asked if there were any unusual records associated with the property, any scandals or incidents that might explain what she'd found. Pauline hesitated, then mentioned that in small-town historical research you learned not everything made it into official records, that families protected their own, especially in the Victorian era when reputation mattered more than truth. But she pulled a newspaper morgue file for the years 1891 to 1895 and suggested Eleanor read through it carefully. The newspaper articles were routine for the most part: social announcements, business transactions, agricultural reports. But in November 1893, a brief item mentioned Dr. Jonathan Ashford treating several townspeople for injuries sustained in what was described as a domestic incident. No details were provided, and the article's vagueness suggested deliberate omission. 2 months later, in January 1894, another brief notice mentioned that Mrs. Catherine Ashford was recovering at home from an unspecified illness. Then nothing until the death notice in March 1894. Elena photographed the articles and thanked Pauline, who offered one more piece of information. Her own grandmother had worked as a maid in the Ashford house in the early 1900s and had always said there was something not right about the living room, that she'd felt watched there, that the air was heavy in ways she couldn't explain. It was family lore, not fact, but it had persisted through 3 generations. Elena drove back to the house with her mind racing. The timeline was becoming clearer. The carved messages had started in 1891, 2 years after the house was built. They'd intensified through 1893 and 1894, the same period when Catherine Ashford had been recovering and then had died. Jonathan Ashford, as a doctor, would have had access to tools sharp enough to carve wood. The handwriting in the carved words, though distorted by the medium, was educated, precise, the work of someone with steady hands and medical training. She returned to the living room and knelt beside the exposed floor, looking at it with new understanding. This was Jonathan Ashford's confession, carved in the privacy of his own home, probably late at night when his daughters were asleep, working out his guilt or trauma or whatever it was that had driven him to document these fragments. She screamed took on new weight. Catherine Ashford had screamed, and her husband had witnessed it, or caused it, or failed to prevent it. The influenza diagnosis on her death certificate suddenly seemed less credible. Influenza killed through respiratory failure, through pneumonia, through fever. It wasn't typically associated with screaming. Elena pulled out her laptop and began researching Victorian medical practices, looking for contexts that might explain what she'd found. What she discovered chilled her. In the late 1800s, women were routinely diagnosed with hysteria for behaviors ranging from depression to assertiveness. Treatments included confinement, sedation, and in extreme cases, surgical intervention. Dr. Jonathan Ashford had lived in an era when husbands had near absolute authority over their wives' medical treatment, when a woman's complaints could be dismissed as female weakness, when screaming might be interpreted as hysteria rather than legitimate distress. The carved floor began to read less like a confession of guilt and more like a record of horror, of things done in the name of treatment that crossed into torture. Elena spent the next week researching obsessively, barely sleeping, ordering meals delivered because she couldn't leave the investigation. She found Jonathan Ashford's medical license records, his professional memberships, his published papers in medical journals. He'd been particularly interested in psychiatric medicine, in the treatment of nervous disorders in women. One paper from 1892 described his experimental approaches to treating what he termed female hysteria with violent manifestations. The language was clinical, detached, but reading between the lines with knowledge of what lay carved in his floor, Elena reconstructed a nightmare. Jonathan had used his own wife as an experimental subject, had confined her to the house, had employed treatments that caused her to scream, had documented his procedures in professional journals while carving his guilty conscience into the living room floor. Catherine had died, probably as a result of his treatment, and he'd listed influenza as the cause to avoid questions. Then he'd lived in that house for 25 more years, walking over the rug that covered his crime, raising his daughters in a space haunted by what he'd done. Eleanor contacted a forensic psychologist she'd worked with on an architecture project involving historic trauma sites, explaining what she'd found. The psychologist, Dr. Raman, agreed to consult remotely, examining Elena's photographs and research. Her assessment was grim but unsurprising. The carved floor represented a compulsive documentation born of guilt that couldn't be expressed publicly, but demanded acknowledgement. Jonathan Ashford had been trapped between his professional reputation and his personal horror at what he'd done. The carving had been his compromise, his private confession that allowed him to live with himself while maintaining his public facade. The question remained, what to do with this discovery? Elena could cover the floor again, replace the rug, sell the house, and let the next owner deal with it or never discover it. She could document it academically, turning her grandmother's home into a case study in Victorian medical abuse and historical trauma. Or she could do something else, something that honored both the victim and the uncomfortable truth about her own family history. She chose exposure and memorial. Elena contacted a documentary filmmaker who specialized in historical true crime, proposing a project about the house, the floor, and the broader context of medical abuse in Victorian America. The filmmaker, a woman named Keisha Davis, jumped at the opportunity. They spent 2 months filming, researching, interviewing historians and medical ethicists, and building a narrative that placed the Ashford house in context with broader patterns of how women's bodies and minds had been controlled and damaged by patriarchal medical establishment. The carved floor was carefully documented, preserved under protective plexiglass so visitors could see it but not damage it further. Elena opened the house as a museum and educational site, focusing on the history of medical ethics and women's rights. The response was overwhelming. Scholars came to study the floor. Journalists wrote about it. Survivors of medical abuse found in it a validation of their own experiences. Catherine Ashford, silent in death for 130 years, finally had her story told. Elena's grandmother Dorothy had known. Elena found the proof in a box of papers in the attic, discovered during the renovation work. A letter written by Margaret Ashford, Dorothy's mother, dated 1945, explained everything. Margaret had been 9 years old when her mother died, old enough to remember but too young to fully understand. Her father, Jonathan, had told her and her sisters that their mother had been sick, that he'd tried everything to help her, that some illnesses were beyond medical science. As Margaret grew older, she'd found discrepancies in the story, had eventually discovered the carved floor after her father's death, and had understood what it meant. She'd covered it with the Persian rug and had sworn never to speak of it, to protect her father's reputation and her own family's standing in the community. She'd passed this burden to Dorothy with instructions to maintain the concealment, and Dorothy had honored that promise until her death. Elena read the letter with tears streaming down her face, grieving for all the women in her family. Catherine, who'd suffered and died, Margaret and Dorothy, who'd carried the weight of knowing, and herself, who now bore the responsibility of truth-telling. The letter ended with a sentence that would stay with Elena forever. "I don't know if I'm protecting him or protecting us, but I can't bear for the world to know what happened in this house, so I choose silence, and I'm sorry for what that choice costs." The documentary premiered at a film festival and was subsequently picked up by a streaming service, where it found an audience hungry for stories about hidden history and systemic abuse. Elena did interviews, spoke at conferences, and gradually came to terms with her complicated legacy. She kept the house, continued running it as a museum and educational center, and lived in the renovated second floor, making peace with the space. The living room, with its protective plexiglass over the scarred floor, became a place of pilgrimage for some, of scholarly interest for others, and for Elena, a daily reminder that silence protects perpetrators while truth honors victims. She thought often about her grandmother, about the weight Dorothy had carried, about the relief she must have felt in death, finally free from the obligation to conceal. Elena wondered if Dorothy had wanted the truth to emerge, if she'd known that leaving the house to her granddaughter, an architect trained to see beneath surfaces, would inevitably lead to discovery. Perhaps it had been Dorothy's final act of rebellion against the silence that had been imposed on her, a way to ensure that Catherine's story would eventually be told without Dorothy herself having to break the promise she'd made to her mother. The thought gave Elena some comfort. The idea that her grandmother had trusted her with this revelation, had chosen her as the one who would finally speak what had been suppressed for 130 years. Visitors to the museum often asked Elena if the house felt haunted, if Catherine's presence lingered. Elena's answer was always the same. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by history, by the accumulated weight of choices made and consequences borne. Catherine Ashford didn't need to haunt the living room because the evidence of her suffering was literally carved into its floor, permanent and undeniable. What haunted the space was the knowledge that this had happened, that a man had tortured his wife in the name of treatment, that his daughters had lived with that legacy, and that silence had been chosen over truth for more than a century. But now, the silence was broken. Catherine's screams, preserved in wood and covered by fabric, had finally been heard. The rug that hadn't been moved in decades had been rolled back, and what was underneath had been terrifying, but it had also been necessary. Necessary to see, necessary to acknowledge, necessary to remember. Because the only thing more terrifying than knowing what happened in that house would be continuing to hide it, allowing another generation to walk over that floor without understanding what lay beneath their feet. Elena had lifted the rug, had exposed the truth, and in doing so had given Catherine Ashford something she'd been denied in life and death: a voice, a witness, and finally, recognition of her suffering. The carved floor would remain visible, a permanent memorial to a woman who screamed and a family that chose eventually to listen.